Hello class, this is Econ 170, Global Economic Environment, and we are using Bruce Wittick's Games in Economic Development. Chapter 1 of that book is called Economic Development, Interdependence, and Incentives, and we are going to be going over some notes from our reading of this Chapter 1. A central relationship in economic development is that between corruption and economic development. Corruption is one of the most important variables in explaining why some countries such as Sweden are highly developed and others such as Nigeria are underdeveloped. We can say that corruption may be more important than natural resource stock in determining levels of economic development. Note, for example, that many underdeveloped countries, for example, Nigeria and Venezuela, possess high natural resource value in both absolute and relative terms, but they have not been able to parlay this into a high level of economic development. However, it is difficult to find an example of an underdeveloped country that possesses a low corruption index. In other words, it seems that low corruption is a necessary condition for high levels of economic development, and we can't say the same of high. What is corruption? Corruption is typically defined as the use of public office for personal gain. Corruption is highly prevalent in Mexico. Mexican citizens pay bribes for nearly 25% of government services according to survey data. Mexico's corruption score is 3.5 on a scale of 1 to 10, according to Transparency International, with 1 being the most corrupt. And relative to other countries, this is moderately high corruption. And we also see that Mexico is not a highly developed country. It's a middle-income country. So we might, at first glance at least, we might say that corruption appears to be holding Mexico back to some degree. We can look at the least corrupt countries according to Transparency International: Iceland, New Zealand, Singapore, Finland. These all have self-report scores, survey scores of 9.4 or more. And then the most corrupt countries, Nigeria, Myanmar, Turkmenistan, and Haiti, are all less than 1.9. And we see that all of the least corrupt countries are developed countries, and all of the most corrupt countries are less developed countries. What drives differences in corruption levels across country? Well, coordination or past coordination can drive differences in the present level of corruption across societies. Some countries may have just originally, for whatever reason, have coordinated on bribery or corruption, and others might have just originally coordinated on non-bribery. And once that coordination was intact, then it stuck ever since, in the sense that it has driven expectations ever since. So if in the first round of a society, in the first round of decision making, corruption was decided upon, then individuals in that society in the second round expected corruption. They expected corrupt behavior on the part of other players, so they chose corruption, and so on and so forth, in third round, fourth round, all the way to present day. Therefore, if a given driver is stopped by a police officer in Utah, that driver is very unlikely to try to bribe the officer because they know that the officer is very likely to be coordinated on non-bribery. Utah has a very low corruption index, even relative to other United States. So to bribe the officer would likely escalate rather than lessen the driver's penalty. If the same driver were in Mexico City and were pulled over by a police officer, they would be expected to be much more likely to bribe the officer, out of the knowledge that that officer is more likely to be coordinated on corruption or coordinated on bribery. So the same person in different settings regardless of personal characteristics. We would expect them to be more likely to behave corruptly if they're in a corrupt environment, just responding to incentives to coordinate with that society. Again, corruption is the use of public office for personal gain. It might be bad in the sense that it creates incentives to engage in non-productive activities, such as crime and bribery, rather than to engage in activities that benefit society. In this sense, corruption can be thought of as a tax or limiting factor on development. Cultures of corruption tend to be persistent. When I am dealing with a government official, I expect that official will be corrupt or not corrupt based on past behavior. Okay, and if I expect them to be corrupt, then I'm more likely to offer them a bribe, thus perpetuating the initial corruption. So we find that past corruption fuels present and future corruption. Like price inflation, corruption is a self-perpetuating phenomenon. So we can say that an individual's level of corruption depends on the behavior of those around them, and vice versa. In economics and political science, we describe structured settings in which individual actions are interdependent as games, strategic games. These are described by game theory. And in this class, we're going to use a lot of normal form or 2x2 decision matrix style game theoretic analysis. Some games have good outcomes for everyone, others have good outcomes for some and poor outcomes for others. Other games or types of games that we'll talk about have poor outcomes for all. In other words, games aren't always fun in the economic sense or in the game theoretic sense of the term. Broad economic outcomes can be viewed as the result of how interactions or games are solved by the players involved. And in the case of, for example, coordination games, it's not clear that how players will solve the game. So we might have a good outcome in one case or in one society and a bad outcome in another case. We might ask, what is economic development? Well, a developed economy is one that generates a relatively high level of opportunity and well-being for its people. Developed economies typically have high rates of educational attainment, high rates of literacy, low rates of infant mortality, high average life expectancies, and low poverty rates. So we can tie each of these factors to opportunity level. To be impoverished would lower your level of opportunity. To have a low life expectancy would lower your opportunities just from a time standpoint. Well, to have a high infant mortality rate would lower your level of opportunity because, well, if you die in infancy, you don't have many opportunities at all. And to not be literate would be to lower your opportunity within society. How does a country become developed? Well, this is a very difficult question and one that may not have the same answer for every country, but we can at least paint broad differences between developed and less developed countries. Developed countries typically are relatively good at perpetuating individual incentives that promote the common good. For example, a strong legal system limits one's ability to become better off by hurting others, for example, by stealing or selling poor quality items. In developed economies, innovation and creativity are typically rewarded to a greater extent than in LDCs or less developed countries. These rewards benefit not only innovators but also manufacturers, distributors, and consumers of the good or of the innovation. In other words, innovations benefit the common good. We can use game theory to understand aspects of development such as migrant flows and migrant clustering. Immigrant groups tend to cluster in particular cities of their new land. Where the marginal or last immigrant settles is influenced by where immigrants before him or her from the same homeland settled previously. In other words, there are beachhead effects in migration. When Allied forces in World War II captured the beaches of Normandy, this allowed subsequent forces to enter France much more easily. Similarly, a Honduran immigrant will have an easier time settling in a city with other Honduran immigrants because it'll be more helpful from a social networking standpoint that the other Honduran immigrants are there. So they'll more easily be able to get food, housing, employment via the social network that exists in that city. We can also use notions within game theory to understand microfinance. Microfinance is a source of financial services for entrepreneurs and small businesses lacking access to banking and related services. The concept was created and implemented by an economics professor named Muhammad Yunus in the late 1970s, originally in Bangladesh. Poor entrepreneurs in the developing world often lack collateral and therefore cannot obtain a startup loan. This circumstance often reinforces their initial poverty. Microfinance overcomes the no collateral problem by issuing loans to individuals within groups. Nobody in the group can obtain another loan. Often it is the case that nobody in the group can obtain another loan until each member of the group has repaid the previous loan. Social acceptance acts as collateral in this case. Failure to repay the loan loses an individual his or her social acceptance within the group. So we're using incentives, group incentives, to establish collateral in microfinance markets, and this has been hugely successful. Many microfinance lenders, including Grameen Bank, that was started by Muhammad Yunus, report repayment rates above 98%, beating repayment rates for most traditional lenders. Throughout this course, we will explore many additional aspects of economic development that can be understood from a strategic or game theoretic standpoint. The ultimate goal is to understand how behavior drives economic outcomes and how certain behaviors might be altered for the common interest, either via government regulation or self-governance of some sort. Thank you.